Tonight, the Iran war is no longer a story you can understand by looking only at Tehran and Tel Aviv. The conflict is spreading outward, touching Gulf airspace, commercial shipping lanes, U.S. diplomatic compounds, oil markets, and the broader question of whether the Middle East is heading toward a contained standoff or a much wider regional crisis. Over the last day, the clearest signal of that expansion came from outside the original battlefield. AP reported that the United Arab Emirates briefly shut its airspace early Tuesday as its military responded to Iranian missile and drone threats. Explosions were heard over Dubai as air defenses moved to intercept incoming fire, and flights resumed only after authorities said the situation had stabilized. That matters because Dubai is not some distant military outpost. It is one of the world's busiest travel and business hubs. When a place like Dubai briefly closes its airspace because of incoming Iranian fire, the message to governments, markets, and ordinary travelers is simple. This war is no longer staying inside the lines that most people expected. At nearly the same time, Reuters reported that rockets and at least 5 drones were launched toward the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Iraqi security sources described it as the most intense such attack since the U.S.-Israel war with Iran began on February 28th. 2 drones were intercepted by the CRAM air defense system, but one struck inside the embassy compound, where fire and smoke were seen rising. The Baghdad strike is a warning that the American footprint in the region is now under heavier pressure. When embassies, bases, and fortified zones start drawing sustained attacks, Washington is no longer just watching a regional war. It is actively managing the protection of people, infrastructure, and deterrence credibility across a broad map that includes Iraq, the Gulf, and major sea lanes. Israel, for its part, says it has launched a new wide-scale wave of strikes across Tehran and is intensifying attacks on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. AP reported that Israeli officials also described fresh Iranian salvos toward Israel. In other words, this is no longer a single exchange, followed by a pause. It is becoming a rolling, multi-front pressure campaign with overlapping retaliations and very little space for de-escalation. So before getting carried away by the loudest claims on social media, it helps to separate what is confirmed from what is still unclear. What is confirmed is that the UAE did briefly close its airspace. Explosions were heard over Dubai. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad came under a serious drone and rocket attack. The Strait of Hormuz remains under severe pressure, and oil is still trading above $100 a barrel. What is less clear in real time are the battlefield details that always flood the information space first. Exact interception rates, exact damage inside defended compounds, and the true military value of each specific strike. In conflicts like this, the earliest version of events is often the noisiest. The clearer picture usually arrives later, after governments, satellite imagery, and independent reporting have had time to catch up. Still, even the verified facts are enough to show the shape of the war. Now, Reuters describes Iran's strategy as a contest of endurance. Tehran appears to be trying to outlast the United States and Israel, not by winning quickly in a conventional sense, but by sustaining missile and drone pressure, threatening trade routes, and creating enough economic pain to make the cost of continued war harder for its enemies to bear. That is a very different objective from a fast battlefield breakthrough. It is closer to strategic exhaustion. The idea is to keep multiple pressure points alive at once: attacks on Israel, threats to Gulf infrastructure, pressure on U.S. interests in Iraq, and disruption around Hormuz. If that pressure keeps markets unstable and governments nervous long enough, Iran may believe time begins to work in its favor. Israel's strategy looks different. AP reported the Israeli military says it has already carried out thousands of strikes on Iran and claims to have knocked out most of the country's air defenses and a large share of its missile launchers. That suggests a campaign built around sustained air power, systematic degradation, and constant pressure on the military networks that allow Iran to launch or coordinate attacks. But here's the complication. Reuters reported that Israeli officials privately see no certainty that the Iranian government will fall, and no clear sign of a mass uprising inside the country. That gap between military success and political outcome is crucial. Destroying launchers and striking leadership assets is not the same as producing a decisive political end state, especially when a wartime environment can also harden internal control. In practical terms, that means both sides can continue to claim momentum, while neither side has yet shown a clear path to resolution. Iran can argue it is still firing, still disrupting, and still widening the cost of the war. Israel can argue it is still degrading Iranian military capability and keeping up operational tempo. But a war with no clean off-ramp is often the kind that grows more dangerous the longer it lasts. One symbolic example came from Tehran's Mehrabad airport. Reuters reported that the Israeli military said it destroyed an aircraft used by Iran's late supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, describing it as a plane used by senior officials and military figures. On its own, that does not decide the war. But symbolically, it signals that Israel is still targeting assets tied to prestige, continuity, and the visible machinery of state power. Another front that deserves close attention is Lebanon. A P reported that Israel is stepping up attacks on Hezbollah militants, even as the wider war continues. The more active the Lebanon front becomes, the more strained Israel's military planning becomes as well. Fighting a long war against Iran is one thing. Fighting Iran while also dealing with a hotter Hezbollah front creates a much more difficult burden in terms of air power, resources, and public endurance. The Iraqi theater matters for the same reason. Reuters notes that Iranian-backed militias have been attacking U.S. interests in Iraq in retaliation for the war. Once those groups intensify operations, the risk is not only more damage on the ground. The risk is an event that forces a sharper U.S. response, now, especially if American personnel suffer heavier casualties, or if repeated attacks begin to look like a sustained campaign rather than scattered retaliation. Then, there is the energy front, which may be the single biggest reason the entire world is watching this conflict so closely. A P and Reuters report that the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively choked, with shipping reduced to a trickle. Roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil normally passes through that narrow waterway. When Hormuz tightens, the war immediately stops being a local military crisis and starts becoming a global economic problem. Reuters warns that about 15% of the world's oil supply is effectively trapped inside the Gulf. Brent crude has remained above $100 a barrel, and governments are already looking for workarounds, not emergency releases or ways to protect consumers from the shock. For Americans, that means the conflict is not just a foreign policy headline. It has a direct path into gasoline prices, inflation pressure, airline costs, and market confidence. Reuters also reports that Washington is running short on easy tools to cushion the blow. The U.S. has already leaned on emergency reserve releases and other stopgap measures, but Hormuz remains an extraordinary choke point. Even if some exports are rerouted, the scale of the disruption is difficult to replace quickly. That is why every new threat to shipping, every strike near oil infrastructure, and every delay in reopening the strait carries outsized weight. At the same time, the diplomatic picture remains weak. AP reported that President Trump has asked allies to help keep Hormuz open, but there have been no immediate commitments on the scale needed to resolve the problem fast. European governments, according to AP, have also been pressing for clarity on the goals of the war before tying themselves more tightly to the military effort. That hesitation matters because strategy gaps tend to widen as wars drag on. If there is a military pattern emerging, it looks like this. Iran and its aligned networks are emphasizing spread, disruption, and pressure across multiple geographies. Israel's emphasizing sustained strikes, leadership pressure, and erosion of military infrastructure. The United States is increasingly pulled into defense of embassies, maritime protection, and management of escalation risk. None of those trends point to a quick, simple end. So what should viewers watch next? First, watch Gulf energy infrastructure. If attacks on ports, tank farms, or shipping intensify, the economic shock deepens immediately. Second, watch U.S. installations in Iraq and the region. A heavier casualty event there could force Washington into a much harder turn. Third, watch whether Israel expands the tempo of strikes inside Tehran and Lebanon. And fourth, watch whether Hormuz remains largely frozen or begins to move under heavier security. There is also a best case and worst case path from here. The best case path is an ugly but managed standoff. Continued pressure, continued rhetoric, occasional strikes, but enough restraint to keep shipping partly moving and keep the war from triggering a wider diplomatic or military cascade. The worst case path is a chain reaction in which embassies, Gulf infrastructure, militia fronts, commercial vessels, and civilian transit corridors all become part of one expanding conflict zone. For now, the evidence points to expansion, not stabilization. The front lines are spreading, the economic consequences are deepening, and the distance between a missile launch in the Middle East and a financial shock in households thousands of miles away is shrinking by the day. That is why this war matters, even to people far from the battlefield. So tonight's bottom line is straightforward. This is no longer only an Iran-Israel story. It is a regional system story. Airspace, embassies, ports, tankers, allied commitments, and public patience. The next phase may not be defined by one spectacular strike. It may be defined by whether the region can absorb repeated pressure without tipping from a brutal war of endurance into a broader breakdown that pulls in still more actors.